Hey, what's up everyone? Today I want to talk about how subtle color mixing can be a huge advantage in your oil painting practice. It's something I consider one of the most important foundational elements for bold, confident brushwork. But before I dive into that subject, here's how I'm approaching this piece. I'm using the shape-based drawing method like usual. I'm starting with just a quick base tone to get some general shapes in place, and then I start blocking in the shapes of shadows and then work through the lighter and lighter tones. After I get just a rough pass, it's going to look really awful for a while, but that's just kind of how I like to start. I like to start with just something to compare to my reference image. That's what I find to be the key to freehand painting, is to always have something on the surface to compare with your reference. So if you are doing this at home and you want to freehand paint, just get something down and then you can slowly start sculpting it into place after that. That's what I ended up doing, and everything turned out pretty accurate, I think, towards the end of this painting. For this painting, I'm working with just 5 colors. It's the Zorn palette, so it's ivory black, cadmium red, yellow ochre, and titanium white. But I did add some transparent oxide red to my palette just to have some flexibility with not always having to use the cadmium red. Since the cadmium red's a little bit more expensive, it's nice to have another subtle red on my palette. And I really find that I love this palette because it just creates a great color harmony, especially with subtle colors. You can get some nice, cool, subtle shadows. You can get some slightly warmer areas. You can go a little yellow if you want. It just has a really great simplicity to it, but you can also have a really strong, subtle color harmony with your paintings. At least something to get started with before you jump into maybe some color accents, which I tend to do. The real focus though of what I want to talk about is how subtle colors do a lot of heavy lifting. I'm mixing the darker tones to be slightly cooler with this painting, and then in the mid-tones I go with a touch of warmer colors, and then when I switch to the lighter colors things get a little bit more yellow, but everything is very subtle. You'd almost look at this and think maybe it's kind of monotone, but there's a lot of subtle things happening where there's these very subtle shifts from cooler to warmer to more yellow that really do create an impact, and I really find that it's such a great way to start a painting, especially if in later layers I decide to really push some intense color. One of the greatest strengths I have, which I think really helps me with my style of painting, is that I know how to color mix directly on my palette. This was definitely a weakness of mine when I was in my early 20s trying to learn how to color mix. It took me a long time to get a handle on it. When I switched to oil paint from acrylic though, that made a big difference because my palette would stay open longer, so I could mix and just leave it open all day while I painted. So that was one of the biggest things. If you're an acrylic painter, try oil paint because it will give you the ability to focus on your color mixing on your palette, so you can put these colors you mix from your palette directly on the surface of your painting without having to worry about doing glazes or things like that. Pretty much every brush stroke that I create on my paintings is opaque, unless I'm trying to do something very unique with certain parts. I do tend to paint with mostly opaque layers. That way when I get into later layers in my paintings, there's these little windows of previous layers that I don't paint over, which creates some of the unique effects that happen in my work. Now at the end of this painting, I do stop with just these subtle colors, but in the later layers, I do plan on pushing some more intense blues. That's what I'm kind of picturing, are some blues. We'll see if it kind of shifts from blues to maybe a little bit more in the purples or a little bit more in the greens. But for right now, something in the blues, and then I'm going to build on that gradually to some really intense hues depending on where it goes. It's all very much conceptual at first, but then as I get to later stages, I start making the decisions on what colors I really want. I do have a reference image with colors on it, but I never hold myself to that. I like to leave it open for just about anything to happen during the painting process. Now that's about it as far as what I want to talk about with this painting. I find that foundationally, color mixing is a huge thing, and if you do want to learn more about my methods, whether it's freehand drawing, the shape-based painting method, practical color mixing exercises, all of these kinds of things, you can check it out over on my Patreon account. Please like, subscribe, follow me over on Instagram if you'd like. Now I'm just going to go ahead and put some music on so you can watch the full process play out for this first layer. Okay, I will talk to you again soon. All right, bye.